In 1905, during the partition of Bengal, the image of Bharat Mata appeared. Mother India, rendered as a goddess, sari-clad, serene, holding the landscape of the nation in her arms. It became one of the most powerful symbols of the freedom struggle. Abanindranath Tagore even painted her. Raja Ravi Verma had already been painting goddesses in a similar register. Saraswati luminous and unreachable, Lakshmi overflowing with abundance, every one of them untouched by anything as ordinary as need or desire. The nationalists needed a symbol that could hold the idea of India together. And they reached, almost instinctively, for the mother. This isn't uniquely Indian. France has Marianne, Germany has Germania, Russia has Mother Russia. Nationalist movements across the world have consistently coded the nation as feminine and maternal, something to be protected, something to be died for, to be revered. But in India, this move tapped into something that was already doing a lot of cultural work, a religious tradition with a rich pantheon of goddesses: Durga, Kali, Saraswati, Lakshmi. More female divinity, arguably, than any other major religious tradition. But here's the thing about goddesses: Saraswati is pure knowledge, Lakshmi is pure abundance, Durga is pure protective force. They are ideals, concentrated, perfected, and abstracted from the mess of an actual embodied life. And very crucially, they are either non sexual or sexual only in a very specific control register. The mother goddess is almost always desexualized. This creates a split. On one side, the sanctified female ideal, selfless, pure, maternal, spiritually elevated. On the other side, the ordinary woman, who has a body, has desire, exists in the world. And real women get caught between these two poles in a way that is genuinely impossible to navigate. You are either reaching towards the ideal, sacrificing, giving, effacing yourself, or you've failed. The historian Uma Chakravarti wrote about this as Brahmanical patriarchy, the way upper caste Hindu tradition constructed an image of the ideal woman that was fundamentally about containment, chastity, domesticity, and devotion. The goddess wasn't evidence that female power was celebrated. She was a template that real women were measured against. And what does this exactly demand in practice? The mother goddess gives everything. She sacrifices without complaint. She finds her meaning entirely in others, in her children, her husband, her community. Self-abnegation isn't just something she does. It is what she is. And when that gets mapped onto real women, something very specific happens. Sacrifice stops being a choice and it becomes a moral requirement. You are not expected to do the labor of care. You are expected to be fulfilled by it and not want anything beyond it. Silvia Federici's argument is relevant here, even though she's writing about early modern Europe, because the mechanism is the same. The figure of the selfless domestic woman wasn't discovered, it was constructed. The question is what the construction does. And what it does is make an enormous amount of labor: cooking, cleaning, childcare, emotional management, care work. These appear as the natural expression of a woman's inner life, rather than work that benefits everyone around her and costs her enormously. In India, women do approximately 352 minutes of unpaid care work every day, according to OECD data. Men do 51. The sanctification of maternal sacrifice is precisely what makes that gap so hard to name as a problem. Because how do you complain about something that has been framed as your spiritual vocation? This is what Gayatri Spivak is getting at when she talks about how the subaltern woman is doubly silenced, once by colonial and class structures, and once by the patriarchal idealization that speaks for her, that tells her story in a register that makes her actual experience unspeakable. And of course, there is a lot of caste dynamics. Because the entire logic, the sanctification, the pedestal, and the honor of being a pure, selfless mother was never applied equally. Upper caste women were primary targets of the goddess ideal. They were the ones required to be pure, confined, and protected. And this was a privilege in some ways, but the protection was inseparable from the restriction. Chastity surveillance, confinement to the domestic sphere, and prohibition on remarriage. These were the price of being sanctified. Dalit women were never granted that status. They were never put on the pedestal. And as Ambedkar argued, the obsessive policing of upper caste women's sexuality, this was the structural mechanism that kept the caste system intact. The purity of upper caste women was the hinge the whole system turned on, which meant her body was a site of caste reproduction, not just personal life. If upper caste women were hyper-controlled through sanctification, Dalit women were hyper-exploited through its absence. They were never afforded the protection that came with the purity ideal, which made them available for agricultural labor, for domestic service, for sexual violence, in ways that upper caste women were normally shielded from. Uma Chakravarti is very precise about this. The goddess ideal didn't just create a hierarchy between men and women. It created a hierarchy between women, where some bodies were sacred and others were simply dispensable. Tarabai Shinde saw this in the 1880s and was furious about it. In Stri, Purush, Tulana, one of the earliest feminist texts in Marathi, she pointed out the absolute hypocrisy of a society that worshipped female divinity and brutalized actual women. Gramsci would call this hegemony, the process by which a system of domination becomes self-sustaining because the people it subordinates have internalized its logic. The goddess ideal is hegemony at its most elegant. It doesn't just tell women to sacrifice, it makes sacrifice feel like the truest expression of who they are. It makes the labor feel like meaning. The feminist and Dalit intellectual traditions in India have always understood that breaking this requires something more than legal reform or policy change. It requires, first, the unglamorous work of naming, saying the goddess is not you. The ideal is not a description of your nature, it's a demand made on your life. The distinction between what has been made to look like your nature and what is actually being asked of you is the beginning of every political movement. And this movement must start from the domestic sphere, in the kitchen, in the living room. In every area you see subtle but ingrained shades of the patriarchy. Thank you so much for tuning in to What the Feminism podcast. All the links for this episode are in the show notes. If you liked what we talked about today, please make sure to listen to our other episodes too. Leave a review and tell us how we can do better. And we can't wait to see you tune in. Bye-bye.